black water, keep on rolling.
Mississippi moon, won't you keep on shining on me?
Oh, black water, keep on rolling.
Mississippi moon, won't you keep on shining on me?
Oh, black water, keep on rolling.
Welcome to New Spheres. I'm Randy Elstrott. You know, the wrath of God is mentioned about 90 times in the Old Testament. This made it the most dominant feature of God's character. That is, until Jesus appeared. When God possesses wrath, his wrath has certain characteristics that human wrath doesn't have. When humans possess wrath, our wrath has certain characteristics that God's wrath doesn't have. All too often, when we read of the wrath of God, we assume his wrath looks like our wrath. This is wrong, and it leads to a faulty image of the Father. Isaiah 55:9 tells us his ways are higher than our ways. This means his wrath is higher than our wrath. Since the Father looks exactly like the Son, we can learn the characteristics of the Father's wrath by looking at Jesus. Here is the list of the 5 differences between God's wrath and human wrath. Number 1, God's wrath always has a redemptive virtue. Human wrath has only one purpose: to harm the object of the wrath. Number 2, God's wrath is transferable. Human wrath is not. Number 3, God's wrath is automatically triggered when certain criteria are met. Human wrath is always the direct result of a human decision. Number 4, God's wrath is accompanied by compassion. Human wrath is not. Number 5, God's wrath appears like a separate entity from God. Human wrath is an extension of the human. We will look closely at each of these differences in this and upcoming audio blogs. To understand redemptive virtue, that is the first difference between God's wrath and human wrath, please imagine with me a set of young siblings, toddlers. They are outside in their backyard on a beautiful spring day playing and creating castles in their sandbox. Because it is spring, we know that there have been recent showers and the sandbox is quite wet. As a result, our toddlers are covered in mud. When they hear the beep of a car horn and a car door shutting, they run to the gate to welcome Dad home. The gate opens and Dad steps into the yard, into the embrace of his muddy toddlers. Dad, of course, doesn't mind the mud. He's just happy to be reunited with his beautiful kids at the end of a long, hard day. Now let's put a slightly different twist on this scenario. Let's imagine the kids are playing in the sandbox. They run to the gate when they hear the car, but when Dad steps through the gate, he's dressed in a white tuxedo. As the kids run to embrace him, he yells loudly, "Stay back! Don't touch me!" You see, Dad is on his way to his best friend's wedding. He is the best man. The wedding begins in a few minutes. There's no time to get the suit cleaned or find a new suit. If this suit gets muddy, it changes the entire wedding. Dad can't be the best man if his tuxedo is muddy, and since there are no other groomsmen wearing a white tuxedo, the whole scheme of the wedding changes. These changes are permanent. A muddy embrace will not just affect things on this day. In all the photographs and videos of the wedding, the bride and groom will look back for years to come on a ceremony that was not all they had intended. It is of the utmost importance that the muddied kids do not touch Dad. If we focus only on the incident in the yard, Dad's rejection appears harsh and unfeeling, but it comes with a redemptive virtue. There was a greater benevolent cause for which this harsh rejection was warranted. The goal of Dad's rejection was not to hurt his kids, although that was one result. The goal of Dad's rejection was to preserve the integrity of his friend's wedding. This was the redemptive virtue of Dad's rejection. We can all agree that Dad in this second scenario did the right thing because it preserved the integrity of his friend's wedding. Rejection of his kids was the lesser of two evils. God is a lot like Dad in this story. He has done quite a few things for which we've called him harsh and unfeeling. People were hurt by some of the things he did. But we know that he always did the right thing because if we look hard enough, we can always find a redemptive virtue for his actions. There was always a greater benevolent cause for which his harsh rejections were warranted. God's harsh actions have been called his wrath, and this is the first difference between God's wrath and human wrath. God's wrath always has a redemptive virtue. a greater benevolent cause for which his actions are warranted. Human wrath has no redemptive virtue. Its sole purpose is to harm the object of the wrath. In the previous audio blog, we saw how Johnny's mother confiscated Johnny's dinosaur toy as an act of discipline. This act of discipline was designed to change Johnny's behavior in the future. In the preceding story, Dad's harsh rejection of his kids was not meant to change their future behavior. It was meant to stop their present behavior. Very often, God's wrath events did not change people. His wrath events annihilated people, sometimes very large groups of people. These wrath events were not acts of discipline. They were corrective actions taken to save an exponentially larger group of people. In John 10:30, Jesus tells us, "I and the Father are one." This is one of the Bible's many declarations that Jesus and the Father are exactly the same. We call this the J equals TF equation. So the thoughts, purposes, passions, and desires we find in Jesus must also be in the Father, because they are exactly the same. In Luke 9:55 in the King James Version, Jesus said, "The Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." If this is true of Jesus, then it must also be true of the Father. The Father is not seeking to destroy men's lives. He's seeking to save them. This means that for all the wrath events we read about, during which the lives of men are destroyed, we must look for a redemptive virtue. God's goal in carrying out that wrath event could not simply have been the destruction of those people. According to Jesus, his goal had to be salvation. Somewhere in each of the stories, there was a grand result, a greater benevolent cause for which God's wrath event was warranted. This greater benevolent cause was the salvation of people, many, many multitudes of people. To see this truth in the most destructive wrath event of the Old Testament, go to newspherespost.org and read the blog series called The Nephilim, the Flood, and the Saving of the Human Race. In the upcoming audio blog, we will visit more differences between God's wrath and human wrath. You don't want to miss this.